Mateo's soft crying echoed through the hospital room in Barcelona. I was lying in bed, exhausted but happy, holding my little miracle in my arms. The smell of antiseptic and the constant hum of the machines mixed with the sweet aroma of my newborn baby. Outside, the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, creating a pattern of light and shadow on the ground. I caressed Mateo's cheek tenderly, marveling at his soft skin and his tiny fingers clinging to my hospital gown. His eyes, still swollen from birth, opened and closed slowly, as if he were trying to adjust to this bright, noisy new world. "You're perfect," I whispered, kissing his forehead. "Your dad will be so excited to meet you." As if my words had conjured his presence, I heard firm footsteps approaching down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, anticipating the arrival of Daniel, my husband. But the rhythm of those steps, no, it wasn't Daniel. They were heavier, more determined. A chill ran down my spine when I recognized who they belonged to. The door burst open, and there she was, Dolores, my mother-in-law, an imposing woman with dyed black hair and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. She was wearing a grey pantsuit that screamed power and money, and her expensive perfume filled the room in seconds. "Carmen," he said in greeting, his voice cold as ice. "I have come to meet my grandson." I sat up a little in bed, adjusting Mateo in my arms. "Dolores, what a surprise. We weren't expecting to see you until next week." She waved her hand dismissively. "And miss out on the opportunity to be the first to see the family heir? No way." She approached the bed, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. He extended his arms, and for a moment, I hesitated. Something in her gaze made me want to protect Mateo, keep him away from her. But how could he deny a grandmother holding her grandson for the first time? Reluctantly, I handed him Mateo. Dolores took it with an experience that surprised me, considering I had never seen her interact with children before. "Hello, little one," he murmured, his voice softening for a moment. "I'm your grandmother." I watched in silence as she examined every detail of Mateo, his little hands, his feet, the shape of his nose. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. Maybe this baby would be the bridge that would finally bring us together, that would melt the ice between us. But then, his eyes narrowed. I watched as his expression changed, going from curiosity to something darker, more dangerous. "Carmen," he said, his voice strained. "Where is Daniel?" I swallowed, feeling the air grow heavy. His in Valencia. He had an important meeting that he couldn't postpone. "He'll arrive tomorrow morning." Dolores nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Mateo's face. "I see. And didn't you think it was strange that he missed the birth of his son?" "Well, the labor came early," I explained, feeling the need to defend my husband. "No one expected Mateo to arrive so soon." Was his only response. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mateo, feeling the tension, began to cry again. I instinctively extended my arms, wanting to comfort him, but Dolores made no move to return it to me. "You know, Carmen," he began, rocking Mateo with an almost mechanical motion, "I've always prided myself on my intuition. It's what has gotten me this far in business. And right now, my intuition is screaming at me." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" His eyes locked onto mine, cold and accusatory. "I mean something's not right here. This baby, there's something about him that's not right." "How can you say that?" I exclaimed, indignation overcoming my fear. "It's perfect. It's healthy. What could not be right?" Dolores moved closer, leaning over me with Mateo still in her arms. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "He's nothing like Daniel. Not even a little bit. And believe me, I know my son better than anyone." I felt like a bucket of cold water had been poured on me. That's ridiculous. Babies change a lot in their first months. Besides, he may look more like me by now. But Dolores was no longer listening. His gaze went back and forth between Mateo and me, as if he were connecting invisible dots. I saw the exact moment he came to a conclusion, and I felt like my world was starting to fall apart. "Carmen," he said, his voice now thick with barely contained fury. "Whose baby is this?" The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What?" It's Daniel's, of course. How can you even suggest? But she interrupted me, her voice rising. Don't lie to me. I've seen that guilty look before. This child is not my son's, is it? You have deceived Daniel. You have betrayed our family. Tears began to well up in my eyes, half from rage, half from disbelief. Dolores, please, you are being irrational. Mateo is Daniel's son. I love your son. I would never do something like that to him. But my words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. Dolores was beyond reason, consumed by a suspicion that had grown over years of distrust of me. I always knew you weren't good enough for him, she hissed. A middle-class girl, with no connections, no fortune of her own. I should have insisted more when Daniel told me he would marry you. But this is unforgivable. I tried to get out of bed, desperate to take Mateo from his arms, but the postpartum pain prevented me from doing so. Please, Dolores, you're scaring the baby. Give it to me. She backed away, holding Mateo like a shield. You will not touch this child until we know the truth. I will call Daniel right now and tell him everything. No. I screamed, panic taking over me. You can't do this. You're wrong, completely wrong. But Dolores was already at the door, Mateo crying in her arms. He turned one last time, his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and contempt. Enjoy your last moments of peace, Carmen. Because when Daniel finds out about this, your perfect life will collapse like a house of cards. And with that, he left the room, taking my son and leaving me alone with a fear that consumed me inside. How had this happened? How had a moment of pure joy turned into the beginning of a nightmare? I sank into bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Outside, I could hear Dolores' angry voice talking on the phone, probably to Daniel. The world he had built with so much love and effort was about to fall apart, and all because of an absurd and cruel assumption. In that moment, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of the hospital and the echo of my own crying, I knew that nothing would be the same again. Mateo's arrival, which should have been the happiest day of my life, had become the beginning of a battle that I wasn't sure I could win. Dolores' eyes traveled over Mateo's face once more, and I saw his expression harden even more. We were in the living room of his luxurious house in Valencia, where he had forced us to go directly from the hospital. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and I could feel how each passing second brought us closer to a breaking point. This baby looks nothing like Daniel, Dolores hissed, each word laden with venom. His eyes, cold as steel, locked onto mine. Carmen, you are a traitor. A liar. I tried to stay calm, even though inside I was shaking. Dolores, please, you're being irrational. Mateo is Daniel's son, I swear. But my words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. Dolores stood up from her chair, imposing in her designer suit, and began to walk from one side of the room to the other. I always knew you weren't enough for my son, he continued, his voice rising with each word. A girl from the neighborhood, no education, no class. How could I let Daniel marry you? I felt tears begin to well up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. I love your son, Dolores. I would never hurt him, I would never betray him. Dolores stopped in front of me, her eyes shining with a mix of fury and triumph. Love. Do you know what love is? Love is loyalty, it's honesty. You don't know anything about that. At that moment, Daniel entered the room. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and stress. He looked from his mother to me, and then to Mateo, who was sleeping peacefully in my arms, oblivious to the chaos that surrounded him. Mom, Carmen, what's going on here? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Before he could respond, Dolores stepped forward. Your wife, Daniel. Your wife has cheated on you. This child is not yours. I watched as the color completely left Daniel's face. He staggered slightly, as if his mother's words had been a physical blow. Carmen, is that true? He asked, his eyes pleading for her to deny everything. I stood up, holding Mateo tightly to my chest. No, Daniel, it is not true. Mateo is your son. Our mother is wrong. Dolores let out a bitter laugh. Wrong? Look at it, Daniel. Look at that baby and tell me you see something of yourself in him. Daniel approached, his eyes fixed on Matteo. For a moment, I thought everything would be okay. That he would see past his mother's poisonous words and recognize his own son. But then, I saw the doubt in his eyes. I don't know, he muttered, taking a step back. He doesn't look much like me, that's true. I felt like the ground was opening up under my feet. Daniel, please. Babies change a lot in their first months. Give it time. But Dolores had already smelled blood. He approached his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. You see, honey, I was always right about her. She's not worthy of you, or our family. Daniel seemed lost, torn between his love for me and his loyalty to his mother. I watched him struggle internally, and my heart broke a little more. Carmen, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe you should leave for a while. Until we get this all straightened out. The words hit me like a slap. What? Daniel, you can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go with a newborn baby? Dolores interjected, her voice thick with false concern. Oh, I'm sure you'll find a place. After all, you must have friends, or maybe that child's real father can help you. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They fell freely down my cheeks as I hugged Matteo tighter. This is crazy. They can't do this to me. They can't do this to Matteo and me. But Dolores was already in action mode. He walked towards the front door and opened it wide. Get out of my house, he ordered, his voice cold and sharp. Get out of here right now and don't come back until you're ready to tell the truth. I looked at Daniel, searching for one last vestige of support, of love. But he avoided my gaze, his shoulders slumping under the weight of doubt and confusion. With a broken heart and trembling legs, I headed towards the door. As I walked past Dolores, I stopped for a moment. This isn't over, I said, my voice low but firm. I will prove them wrong. And when I do, I hope they can live with the guilt of what they have done. And with that, I walked out into the night of Valencia, with Matteo in my arms and the future more uncertain than ever. Tears burned my eyes as I hugged Matteo tightly. The cold of the Valencian night seeped through my clothes, but the warmth of my baby against my chest kept me anchored to reality. I was in the small park in front of Dolores's house, sitting on a bench, desperately trying to think of our next step. Don't worry, my love, I whispered to Matteo, who was sleeping, oblivious to all the chaos. Mom is going to fix this. That's when an idea popped into my mind. It was risky, but it could be our only chance. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed Daniel's number. After several rings, he finally answered. Carmen. Her voice sounded broken, confused. Daniel, listen to me, I interrupted, my voice firmer than I felt. I know you're confused and hurt, but there's a way to resolve this once and for all. There was a moment of silence before he responded. I took a deep breath. A paternity test, I suggested, my voice shaking slightly. We will do a test to prove my innocence. I could hear the surprise in his voice. Carmen, are you sure? It's the only way, I insisted. It's the only way to stop your mother from poisoning your mind with her lies. There was another long silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. Okay. We'll do it. I felt momentary relief, but I knew this was just the beginning. There's something else, I added, mustering all my courage. I want your mother to take the test too. What? Why? That doesn't make sense, Carmen. I closed my eyes, preparing for what he was going to say. Daniel, there's something you don't know. Something I've been suspecting for a while, but I never had the courage to tell you. What are you talking about? The confusion in his voice was palpable. Your mother. I think she keeps secrets too. Secrets about your past, about your true origin. The silence that followed was deafening. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Carmen, that is a very serious accusation. I know, I replied, my heart pounding. That's why I want her to take the test too. If she has nothing to hide, she shouldn't have a problem doing it, right? I could hear Daniel's heavy breathing on the other end of the line. I need to think about this. I need to talk to her. Do it, I urged. But don't tell her about the test for her yet. Just, Watch her reaction when you mention the paternity test for Matteo. After agreeing on the details, we hung up. I stayed sitting on the bench, gently rocking Matteo, while I waited. The night progressed, and with it, my anxiety grew. Almost an hour later, I saw Daniel leave the house. His face was pale, his eyes red. He slowly approached and sat next to me on the bench. I told him about the test. He murmured, his voice hoarse. "And Carmen, you were right. Something's not right." "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always did when he was nervous. When I mentioned the test, I saw fear in her eyes. For a second, she looked terrified. Then she tried to dissuade me, saying it wasn't necessary, that it was a waste of time and money. I nodded slowly. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him we were going to do it anyway. That we needed to be sure." He paused, swallowing. "And then I told her that she would get tested too." "And?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Carmen," the color drained from her face. She started to shake and she fainted. I felt a mix of shock and validation. "Oh my God." Daniel took my hand, squeezing it tightly. "What's going on, Carmen? What is my mother hiding from us?" I looked at Matteo, still asleep in my arms, and then at Daniel. "I don't know for sure. But I think we'll find out soon." At that moment, the door of the house burst open. Dolores appeared, her face a mask of fury and fear. "You too," he shouted, advancing towards us. "What do you think you're doing?" Daniel stood up, putting himself between his mother and us. "Mom, we need the truth. The whole truth." Dolores stopped, her eyes darting frantically between Daniel, Matteo, and me. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw true panic in her eyes. He began, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect you, Daniel. I've always wanted to protect you." And with those words, I knew we were on the verge of discovering a truth that would change our lives forever. The following weeks were hell. After that night in the park, Daniel insisted that we return to the house, more for Matteo than anything else. I reluctantly agreed, knowing it would be difficult, but not imagining how torturous it would really be. The Valencia mansion, which had once seemed imposing and elegant to me, now felt like a prison. Every corner was permeated with tension, every silence loaded with unspoken accusations. Daniel, torn between love for me and loyalty to his mother, seemed like a ghost in our own house. His eyes, once full of life and joy, were now dull, shadowed by doubt and internal conflict. One morning, while I was feeding Matteo in the kitchen, I heard Daniel and Dolores arguing in the study. "Mom, we need to do those tests. We can't keep living like this." Daniel's voice sounded exhausted. "Why do you insist on this, son? Don't you trust me?" Dolores' response was loaded with emotional manipulation. "It's not about trust, it's about the truth. Carmen, Matteo, and I deserve to know it." The sound of something breaking interrupted the conversation. I assumed that Dolores had thrown something in a fit of anger. It was her modus operandi when she felt cornered. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Daniel spent most of his time locked in his office, supposedly working, but I knew he was avoiding facing the reality of our situation. Dolores, for her part, alternated between completely ignoring me and throwing me looks full of contempt. I took refuge in Matteo. My little boy had become my anchor, my reason to continue fighting. I sang lullabies to him in whispers, told him stories of a better future, away from all this madness. "Soon, my love," she said as she rocked him to sleep. "Soon we will know the truth and everything will be fine." One night, when the tension seemed to have reached its peak, I made a decision. I waited until everyone was asleep and snuck into Daniel's bathroom. With shaking hands, I took his toothbrush and put it in an airtight bag. Then, I headed to Dolores' room. The door was ajar and I could see his sleeping figure on the bed. Holding my breath, I crept in and grabbed a brush from her dresser. Back in my room, I looked at Matteo asleep in his crib. "It's for us, baby," I whispered, caressing her soft cheek. The next day, with the excuse of taking Matteo to the pediatrician, I left the house. Actually, I went to a private clinic in the center of Valencia. He had made the arrangements in advance, paying a considerable sum to ensure discretion and speed. "We need the results as soon as possible," I told the nurse as I handed her the samples and a lock of Matteo's hair. "It usually takes a few weeks," she replied. "Please," I insisted, sliding an envelope with extra money. "It's urgent." She looked at the envelope and then at me, understanding in her eyes. "I'll do what I can. Maybe in a week." That week was the longest of my life. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat. Every look from Dolores made me wonder if she suspected something. Daniel, immersed in his own confusion, barely noticed what was happening around him. Finally, I received a call from the clinic. The results were ready. With the excuse of doing some shopping for Matteo, I quickly left the house. At the clinic, the same nurse greeted me with a friendly smile. "Here you go," he said, handing me a sealed envelope. "I hope you find the answers you are looking for." With trembling hands, I took the envelope and left the clinic. I didn't dare open it there. I needed to be alone. I needed to prepare myself for whatever I found inside. I drove to a small park nearby and sat on a bench far away. Matteo slept peacefully in his stroller, oblivious to the crucial moment we were experiencing. I took several deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. Finally, with one swift movement, I opened the envelope and took out the papers. My eyes frantically scanned the lines of text, searching for the crucial information. And there it was, in black on white: probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. "I knew it," I whispered, clutching the papers to my chest. "I knew it, my love. You are Daniel's son." But my relief was short-lived. My eyes landed on the second part of the report, the one that compared Daniel's DNA to Dolores's. The world seemed to stop when I read, "Probability of mother-son relationship, 0%. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. Dolores was not Daniel's biological mother. All his accusations, all his venom, was this what he was trying to hide? With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed Daniel's number. "Carmen, what's wrong?" His voice sounded worried. "Daniel," I managed to say between sobs. "I need you to come to the park near the San Rafael Clinic. Now. It's important." "I'm going there," he responded without hesitation. While I waited, I looked alternately at Matteo and at the papers in my hands. How was I going to explain this to Daniel? How was this going to change our lives? When I saw Daniel approaching, I stood up. His face showed concern and confusion. "Carmen, what's wrong? Is everything okay with Matteo?" I took his hands in mine and looked into his eyes. "Daniel, there is something you need to know. Something that will change everything." And with that, I began to tell him about the tests, about my suspicions, and about the truth I had just discovered. The truth is that, without knowing it, I was about to shake the foundations of our family and everything we thought we knew. When the envelope arrived home, my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it. Daniel and I were in the living room, Matteo sleeping peacefully in his portable crib next to us. Dolores, for her part, paced nervously back and forth, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Open it already," Dolores snapped, her voice tight and high-pitched. I looked at Daniel, searching his eyes for support. He nodded slightly, his face a mix of fear and determination. With a deep sigh, I tore open the envelope and took out the papers. My eyes frantically scanned the lines, searching for the crucial information. And there it was, in black on white: probability of paternity, 99.9999%. "Daniel is the father," I read aloud, my heart pounding. Tears began to well up in my eyes, a mix of relief and vindication. "You see, Dolores. I told you. I never lied to you." Daniel approached me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "I'm sorry, Carmen. I'm so sorry for doubting." Dolores, however, remained silent. His face had lost all color, and his eyes were fixed on the papers I was holding. "Let me see that," he said finally, extending a trembling hand. I handed him the results, watching as his eyes scanned the document. Suddenly, I saw his expression change. The color completely drained from his face and his hands began to shake violently. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Daniel pulled away from me, frowning. "Mom, what's wrong? You already saw the results." Carmen told the truth. But Dolores wasn't looking at the part about Mateo's paternity. His eyes were fixed on another section of the report. "Daniel," he said, his voice breaking. There's something else here." I approached, taking the papers from his trembling hands. And then I saw it. The second part of the report, the one that compared Daniel's DNA with Dolores's. Probability of mother-child relationship, 0%, I read quietly, shock washing over me. Daniel looked at me, confused. What does that mean?" I swallowed, trying to find the right words. "Daniel, according to this, Dolores is not your biological mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel staggered, as if he had received a physical blow. He plopped down on the couch, his face a mask of disbelief and shock. This can't be true," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Mom, tell them it's a mistake. Tell them these results are wrong." But Dolores didn't respond. Instead, he collapsed into a nearby chair, his body racked by silent sobs. "I'm sorry," she finally said, through tears. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I never wanted you to know like this." Dolores' words fell like bombs in the room. Daniel jumped up, his face contorted with anger and confusion. "What do you mean you never wanted me to know like that? Did you know? You've known this whole time that you weren't my biological mother?" Dolores nodded slowly, unable to look her son in the eyes. "Yes, I knew that. I've always known that." I sat next to Daniel, taking his hand in mine. I could feel him trembling, fighting for control. "Explain," he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Dolores took a deep breath, as if gathering all her strength. "Your father and we couldn't have children. We tried for years, but nothing worked. We were desperate. And then we met a young woman. She was pregnant and couldn't keep the baby. She offered us to adopt him." Tears ran freely down Dolores' face as she continued. "You were so small, so perfect when you were born. We loved you from the first moment. We decided that no one needed to know the truth. That you would be our son in every way." Daniel stood up, walking away from all of us. His entire body was shaking. My whole life has been a lie." "No, honey," Dolores pleaded, standing up. "Our love for you was always real. You are our son, regardless of blood." But Daniel was no longer listening. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and realization. "That's why you were so sure she was hiding something. That's why you insisted she get tested too." I nodded slowly. I had suspicions, but I wasn't sure. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry you had to find out like this." Daniel looked at Mateo, who was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the chaos that surrounded him. He then looked at Dolores, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. I need to be alone," he finally said, heading toward the door. "Daniel, please," Dolores begged, trying to stop him. But he moved away from her touch as if it burned him. "Don't follow me. I don't want to talk to you right now." And with that, he left the house, leaving Dolores and me in a silence charged with unspoken emotions and newly discovered truths. I approached Mateo, gently stroking his head. "What are we going to do now?" I murmured, more to myself than to Dolores. Dolores, who seemed to have aged years in a matter of minutes, looked at me with eyes full of regret. "I don't know, Carmen. I really don't know." As I gently rocked Mateo, my mind was spinning. How would this affect our family? Could Daniel forgive this lie? And more importantly, how could we help him process this truth that had shaken the foundations of his identity? The future, which just a few hours ago seemed bright and full of possibilities, now looked uncertain and turbulent. But as I looked at my son, I knew that no matter what came, we would fight through it together. For Daniel, for Mateo, for our family. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel had returned after hours of absence, his face marked by fatigue and confusion. Dolores was sitting on the couch, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. I was standing by the window, with Matteo asleep in my arms, watching the scene with a mixture of anxiety and compassion. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice hoarse with emotional exhaustion. "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. No more lies, no more secrets." Dolores nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before beginning. "It all started 35 years ago. Your father and we had been trying to have a child for years. We consulted the best doctors, we tried all the treatments available, but nothing worked. We were devastated, Daniel. The desire to be parents gave us consumed." He paused for a moment, his eyes lost in distant memories. "One day, a young woman approached us. She was the niece of one of our maids. She was pregnant and couldn't keep the baby. She offered to give him to us for adoption." Daniel listened in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. "And they just agreed? Without thinking about the consequences?" Dolores shook her head. "It wasn't that simple. We thought about it a lot, we consulted with lawyers. But in the end, the desire to be parents was stronger. We arranged everything to make it look like I had been pregnant. We even temporarily moved to another city during the last months before of your birth." "Who else knew?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just your father and me. And of course, the biological mother. But she disappeared shortly after giving birth to you. We never heard from her again." Daniel stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "And you never thought to tell me? Were you planning to take this secret to the grave?" Dolores burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, son. We were afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid that you would hate us if you found out. Over time, it became more and more difficult to find the right moment to tell you." "May, or what is happening?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking. The word mom in Portuguese left his lips almost involuntarily, a vestige of his childhood that betrayed the depth of his pain. The use of Portuguese seemed to surprise Dolores as much as me. She looked up, her eyes full of tears. "Daniel, me." "No," he interrupted her, her voice now firmer. "No more excuses. I want the truth. The whole truth." Dolores nodded, breathing deeply before continuing. "Your biological mother was Brazilian. A young immigrant who worked as a domestic employee for a friendly family. When we knew about her pregnancy and her desire to give the baby for adoption, we saw a chance. We fixed everything so that it seems that you had been born in Spain, but you were born in Brazil." Daniel dropped on the couch, the shock evident in his face. Am I Brazilian?" "By birth, yes," Dolores confirmed. "But we raise you as Spanish. You are Spanish, Daniel. This is your home, your country." "A home built on lies," Daniel murmured, his voice full of bitterness. I approached him, sitting by his side with Matthew still in my arms. "Daniel," I said softly, "I know this is a shock, but think of Matthew. He loves you unconditionally, regardless of your origin. And you love him. That's what really matters in a family." Daniel looked at our sleeping son, and for a moment, I saw a flash of tenderness in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a determination look. "I need to know more," he said, turning to Dolores. "I need to know about my biological mother. His name, where it was exactly, why he decided to give me for adoption." Dolores seemed to sink more on the couch with each question. "His name was Maria da Silva. He was from Recife, in the northeast of Brazil. As to why she decided to give you for adoption, she was very young, Daniel. He was barely 18 years old. He was alone in a foreign country, without family support." Daniel nodded slowly, processing the information. "And my biological father?" "Here," Dolores doubted. She never told us a lot about him. He just said she wasn't in a position to be a father." "I want to look for her," Daniel said suddenly. "Maria. I want to know my roots, understand where I really come from." Dolores paled. "Daniel, more than 30 years have passed. We don't know where he is, if he's still alive." "I don't care," he interrupted. "I need to do this. For me, for Matthew. I need to know the complete truth." I turned to him, taking his hand. "I will support you in what you decide, Daniel. If you want to look for your biological mother, we will do it together. Daniel looked at me, a mixture of gratitude and love in his eyes. Then he turned to Dolores. Mom. Dolores was corrected, and I saw how she shuddered at the change of name. I need time to process all this. To decide how I feel, what I want to do. Dolores nodded, tears running freely down his cheeks. I understand it, son. I just remember that I love you. That I have always loved you, from the moment I held you in my arms for the first time. Daniel got up, his face a mask of contradictory emotions. I need to be alone. I'm going to take a walk. While we saw him get out of the room, I felt that the weight of the world fell on our shoulders. I looked at Dolores, who seemed to have aged years in a matter of hours. What are we going to do now? I asked in a low voice. Dolores looked at me, his eyes full of a mixture of repentance and determination. The only thing we can do, Carmen. Be there for him, support him in what he decides. And expect that one day he can forgive us. While I rocked Matthew in my arms, I thought about the unexpected turns that our lives had given. Of accused of allied, of a daughter-in-law rejected to confidant. And now, in front of us, a new chapter full of uncertainty was opened, but also of possibilities. Only time would say how this revelation would change our lives and our family forever. The silence that followed the revelation of Dolores was deafening. Daniel was standing, motionless, his face a shock and confusion mask. I held Matthew against my chest, as if I could protect him from the emotional storm that surrounded us. Dolores, sunk on the couch, seemed to have aged decades in a matter of minutes. I had an affair, Dolores repeated, his voice just a whisper. Years ago. And now I know that your father was not your biological father, Daniel. The words fell like bombs in the room. Daniel staggered, as if he had received a physical blow. He leaned against the wall, his eyes closed with force. How could you finally articulate, his voice hoarse for the contained emotion? Dolores tried to get up, extending a hand towards his son, but Daniel backed away as if his touch could burn him. Please let me explain, Dolores begged. It was so long ago, your father and I were going through a bad time. He was always working, I felt alone and careless. And then I met Alejandro. I don't want to know the details, Daniel interrupted it abruptly. I don't want to know how you betrayed Dad, how you lied to us all for decades. I approached Daniel, still in my arms. Honey, I said gently, I know this is a shock, but maybe we should listen to the whole story. Daniel looked at me, his eyes full of a mixture of gratitude and pain. He nodded slowly, returning his attention to Dolores. He continues, he said dryly. Dolores took a deep breath before continuing. The affair lasted only a few months. When I discovered that I was pregnant, I finished it immediately. I told your father that the baby was his, and he was so happy. He never questioned anything. And Alejandro? I asked, feeling more in history. He never knew it, said Dolores, his voice full of remorse. He moved shortly after, and I decided to bury that part of my past. Daniel passed her hands through her hair, a gesture she always did when she was overwhelmed. All my life has been a lie. No, son, Dolores protested, getting up. Our love for you was always real. You are our son, regardless of biology. But Daniel didn't listen to. He turned to the door, his body tense like a rope about to break. I need air, he murmured, and before we could stop him, he left the house, leaving us in a silence loaded with emotions not said and newly discovered truths. I looked at Dolores, who seemed to have collapsed in herself. What are we going to do now? I asked, more for myself than for her. I don't know, Carmen, he replied, his voice barely audible. I really don't know. The following hours were a blur of telephone calls without response and unreasonable messages. Daniel did not return, and with every minute that passed, my concern grew. Finally, near midnight, I heard the sound of keys at the door. Daniel entered, his pale and dark face, but with a determination in his eyes he had not seen before. I have made a decision, he announced, looking at Dolores and me. We leave Valencia. What? I exclaimed, surprised. Daniel, what are you talking about? I can't stay here, he explained, his firm voice. Every corner of this house, every street in this city is full of false lies and memories. I need a new beginning, far from all this. Dolores got up, his eyes full of tears. Son, please, don't make hasty decisions. We can talk about this, we can. There is nothing more to talk about, Dolores, Daniel interrupted her, and I saw how she shuddered at the use of her name instead of Mom. I've spent the last hours thinking, and this is what I need to do. I approached him, taking his hand. Where do you want to go? Daniel looked at me, a mixture of love and gratitude in his eyes. Seville. I have a friend there that can help us establish us. It's far enough to start over, but not so far as to cut all ties. I nodded slowly. Part of me wanted to protest, argue that we were acting hastily. But another part, the part that had seen Daniel's eyes, knew that this was what he needed. Okay, I finally said. I will go where you go. We are a family. Daniel hugged me strongly, and for a moment, I felt that everything would be fine. The following days were an activity whirlwind. We packed our belongings, we made arrangements for the transfer, we said goodbye to friends and neighbors. Dolores watched everything with a mixture of resignation and pain, but did not try to stop. I think I knew that any attempt would only push Daniel further. The night before our departure, while the things of Matthew ended up packing, Dolores appeared at the door of the room. Carmen, he said gently, can I talk to you for a moment? I nodded, following her to the kitchen. There, to my surprise, an envelope gave me. It's for Daniel, he explained. A letter explaining everything. Things I could not say in person. And also, information about Alejandro, his biological father. In case he wants to look for him. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the truths it contained. I'll give it to him, I promised. Dolores nodded, tears shining in his eyes. Take care of him, Carmen. And my grandson. I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I love them all. I hugged her, surprising both. I will, I whispered. And maybe, over time, Daniel can forgive. The next morning, we loaded the car under a grey sky that seemed to reflect our mood. Daniel said goodbye to Dolores with a rigid hug and few words. I gave Matthew to hug him one last time, and I saw how tears ran freely through his cheeks while holding his grandson. While we were moving away from the house, I looked through the rearview mirror. Dolores was standing at the entrance, a lonely figure that became smaller and smaller. I felt a stab of sadness, but also a spark of hope. Maybe this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. The trip to Seville was long and silent. Daniel drove with his eyes fixed on the road, lost in his thoughts. I alternated between taking care of Matthew and looking at the changing landscape out the window. When we finally arrived at our new home, a small apartment in the heart of Seville, the sun was putting on, bathing the city in golden and reddish tones. Welcome home, Matthew, I whispered, holding our son while we entered the apartment. Daniel left his bags on the floor and approached us, hugging us both. Thank you, he murmured against my hair. Thank you for being here, for supporting me in this. Always, I replied, kissing his cheek. We are a family. We will overcome this together. That night, while Daniel slept and I fed Matthew in the gloom of our new room, I reflected on the unexpected twists that our lives had given. From accused of allied, daughter-in-law rejected to Pilar de la Familia. And now, here we were, in a new city, trying to rebuild our lives. I looked at the envelope that Dolores had given me, hidden in my bag. Someday, when the wounds had healed a little, he would give it to Daniel. Maybe then he would be ready to face the whole truth, to explore that unknown part of his identity. For now, however, we would concentrate on the present. In building a home, in raising Mateo, in healing. The past would always be there, waiting to be confronted, but we had a future ahead. And while Mateo fell asleep in my arms, I felt a wave of determination. It didn't matter what the future would hold us, we would face each challenge together, like the family we were.